Hi, a quick word before we get started. These are a group of 5 different mini essays discussing the problems with media. I wrote these for a class in the field of media studies, but decided to turn them into a video. With that out of the way, please enjoy.
I love animated films. They have a long and rich history of brilliant storytelling and have truly evolved into an art form that is capable of literally anything. Thanks to the work of talented artists and brilliant writers, animation has limitless creative power. However, the success of animation makes it an easy target for studio executives to make pandering garbage to appeal to as many people as possible. Let's examine how this happens with a specific example: Illumination. Illumination is a relative newcomer to the animated film market, releasing their first film in 2010, but they quickly became a juggernaut of the industry. With their very first movie, they smashed the box office, attaining the eighth highest numbers of the entire year. With just the box office returns of its first ever movie, Illumination had enough money to finance their next 7 years of movies. How did they do this? Well, first off, this movie is admittedly decent. It's far from perfect, but it's much better than anything the studio has released since. Secondly, Illumination's films have a tiny budget compared to other animated film studios. Their average movie costs around $75 million, which is certainly not a small number, but that's less than half the cost of a Disney or Pixar film. Finally, the secret to Illumination's success is pandering. Illumination has painstakingly discovered what kids like about animated movies. They like bright, colorful spectacles full of slapstick humor and cute sidekick characters. At the same time, they discovered that parents like celebrity voices and a movie that isn't annoying enough to make them want to put the DVD into a paper shredder. With this realization, every movie made by the studio has the same basic formula. They're generally low effort films with a celebrity cast, bright colors, basic art style, and low budget. Once the movie makes an exorbitant amount of money, they slap the characters into limitless brand deals.
The Lorax is here at IHOP.
Here you go.
This ultra consumerist approach to making an animated film makes a lot of money and impacts the kids in as many ways as possible. To quote Sturken and Cartwright, brand identity shapes the child's culture, informing their values, tastes, and perspectives. Over a very brief period of history, consumerism came to be understood as essential to the economic stability of many societies and has ultimately come to be understood as a primary activity of citizenship and belonging. This idea that obsessing over an animated franchise is integral to our culture is a very massive problem. To be clear, this isn't unique to Illumination or animation in general. However, Illumination is a better example of this trend because their films are a lot more obviously pandering. For example, let's examine how they treat the works of Dr. Seuss, particularly their adaptation of The Lorax. The original children's book is an environmentalist critique of exploitation through capitalism and consumerism. However, the film cannot directly say anything that resembles the original message or face potential backlash. The main character, Zac Efron, only cares about saving the environment because he wants to impress his crush, Taylor Swift. On top of diluting the message beyond recognition, Illumination uses the Lorax and other characters as a literal car advertisement.
Who delivers outstanding fuel efficiency without compromising the joy of driving? Mazda with SkyActiv technology. And who received the only certified Truffle-a-Tree seal of approval? Mazda with SkyActiv technology.
This actively defies Seuss's intent and is done only to make more money. The fact that Illumination completely desecrated Seuss shows that they disregard messages and meaning completely in their films. Stopping this trend will be no easy task, but there are potential paths that we can take. Staying aware of the warnings proposed by Sturken and Cartwright is a good start. Conforming to brand identity simply because the culture dictates it is not the way to fixing anything. On top of that, supporting animated films just because they're animated will only encourage companies to stop focusing on the art and start making money. In a sense, the Lorax is a perfect representation of what we need to do. Producers need to avoid the corruption of greed, and consumers need to stop enabling it. Because, like Seuss himself said,
unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not.
this next section is tangentially related to the previous one, but it targets a different big picture issue. That issue is brand loyalty, or the positive association customers attach to a product or brand simply because it is a particular brand. This isn't always a bad thing, but things can quickly get carried away. When brand loyalty goes too far, it encourages companies to get lazy because people will buy the product anyway. To illustrate this, we're going to look at a few examples. Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, was certainly not a movie that played things safe. It took a lot of risks because it wanted to push the limits of what Star Wars could be. For many people, these risks were unwelcome and it caused an uproar. However, the movie was still an incredible success and critics loved it. In response, when making Episode 9, Disney practically threw something together in order to appeal to as many fans as possible. The result was extremely bland cinematography, characterization, tone, and writing. It also removed the exceptional parts about The Last Jedi and completely ignores its flaws. The finished trilogy is broken and disjointed, but Disney still made loads of money anyway. How much? Well, $4.4 billion with just the sequel trilogy. Disney realized they didn't have to try very hard in order to make money, especially when the last bit of effort got so much hate. When a company gains a large following, they might reject what made them successful to begin with. A large company can disregard quality and still maintain a healthy profit margin thanks to the name they've built. Companies can even feel safe in hiking up prices for these products, knowing that people will still buy them. For example, Apple and its iPhone XS had the gargantuan price tag of $1,250 when it came out in 2018, yet the phone only costs $443 to manufacture. That is a difference of $807 for every phone. I'm not saying a product should be sold at or near manufacturing cost, but triple the price is exorbitant. But why should we care about this? Well, if insane price markups aren't enough, we're being conditioned to believe what companies tell us. Sturken and Cartwright explain how by saying cinemas and television manufacture desire not only for lifestyles, but also for things. Not just any goods, but brand name goods, displayed and advertised in the shows or worn and used by the stars or discussed in popular new magazines. Clearly, this directly states how people are swept up into brand loyalty without even having owned the product. Even parodies of this trend aren't safe. Sturken and Cartwright provide an excellent example of this as well. They state Shepard Fairey, a world renowned street artist, emerged from the mid 1990s skateboarding scene to achieve early cult status with his Andre the Giant Has a Posse sticker campaign featuring images that depicted the famous wrestler, underscored with the word obey, a graphic designed to critique advertising's ubiquitous demand for brand loyalty. Fairey himself is now a brand. Fairey's campaign became an icon and was eventually turned into a product and clothing brand. Now people buy Obey hats and shirts without knowing the intent behind the campaign and unintentionally feeding into the very thing that the campaign was parodying. How does a person combat this when even parodies are being exploited? Well, there's a few different ways a person can go about making a difference. Chiefly, make smart and well-informed purchases. Read reviews and consider pros and cons before making a major investment. And don't pre-purchase something simply because you like the series or brand. However, if you think the new iPhone is worth triple the manufacturing cost, then go ahead and buy it. As a consumer, you have a power to make your own choices and to buy what you want. Exercise that power to ensure that brands don't get lazy. The next topic is something vastly different from the previous two. First, let's examine these two magazine covers. One is from Newsweek and the other is from Time. They were both on shelves at the same time, Both were about the same topic, and both featured the same original photo. The key difference here is that one photo was digitally altered to make the man on the cover, O.J. Simpson, appear to have darker skin than his actual tone. Time magazine is a trusted source of information, but they changed a man's skin tone, presumably in a defamation attempt. This is a perfect example of the next topic, the intentional editing of photos to manipulate people. But why exactly is this an issue worth discussing? In the news, editing photos is worth getting upset over because we trust the news for accurate sources of information. When the media is altering photos to fit their biases, we lose the opportunity to gather what important information we can and to draw our own conclusions. However, news reporting is not the only perpetrator of this. Advertising and fashion are also guilty, and it creates unfair and unrealistic standards of beauty. Many people see these completely unrealistic photos that have been incredibly distorted, and they feel like they're inferior. This causes people to strive for an unattainable or extremely unhealthy goal. This practice is manipulative. It creates an unfair image in the minds of the viewer, and it can portray news stories unfairly, and it can psychologically damage people because they feel inferior to a digitally altered image. It can also purposefully make someone look worse in a defamation attempt, such as the O.J. Simpson example from Time. Almost everyone consumes media, and almost everyone is therefore susceptible to be tricked by these unfair and deceitful tactics. This does not just happen in new photos either. People will sometimes edit historical photos as well. For example, this photo of Winston Churchill was altered to remove the cigar in his mouth. This could be a relatively unimportant detail to admit, but it is another example of a deliberate attempt to change the perception of someone. We all need to be conscious consumers of media. It will be difficult to immediately change how the media functions, but we can help by increasing our awareness. We need to know that there is almost always more to a story than what we initially see. It's also important that we get information from more than one source as an attempt to limit the amount of bias we encounter. We can demand these deceitful practices stop, and companies will begin to listen. Despite the editing of photos being a widespread issue, some companies have pledged to stop any use of Photoshop or other means of editing their photos for advertisement. More and more companies are realizing the effects of altering images, and it's important that we encourage this change. Hopefully, with enough work, the beauty industry's biggest secret will no longer be Photoshop by Adobe. Sensationalism is a journalistic tactic with the intent of editing to attract as much attention as possible. It has many forms, including but not limited to appealing to too much emotion, intentionally blowing things out of proportion, using tabloid tactics or clickbait, and leaving out information. This has garnered large amounts of attention in the past few years, but contrary to popular belief, this practice has deep roots in American history and has been happening since before America was even independent. Newspapers were example to blow the so-called Boston Massacre out of proportion to stir up hate in the British occupying forces. This tactic worked as part of a chain of events that eventually led to the American Revolutionary War. Sensationalism is everywhere you can possibly imagine when it comes to media. People typically notice it in the news, but it can also be found in online videos, movie trailers, and numerous other examples. Sensationalism is deceptive, manipulative, and toxic. In today's world, producers are concerned with garnering the most attention, and some people are willing to sacrifice integrity to get there. They take the fast lane to as much money as possible without considering how it affects their content and their platform. You can spot this type of content all over sites like Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Instagram, YouTube, and basically anywhere else that has ads. In fact, several sites have grown so accustomed to this trend that the only content they put out is sensationalist. As another historical example of American sensationalism, the United States had its eyes set on Cuba as a potential new territory, but Spain already occupied the island. Suddenly, the USS Maine exploded without discernible cause. The US press quickly got to work blaming the Maine's explosion on Spain without any evidence, and then the Spanish-American War began. Now that we are familiar with how sensationalism is a problem, perhaps we can discuss how to lessen its impact. The most important tactic to employ against sensationalism is simply to remain vigilant. Learn what tactics sensationalist outlets employ, including hyperbole, stretching the truth, explosive word choice, and misleading photos. Don't fall into traps and do your best to fact check as well. If you see obvious clickbait, don't hesitate to call it out. Lastly, any aspiring content creators should avoid intentionally clickbaiting or misleading people. Honesty is more fulfilling and people will appreciate it. In conclusion for this section, the media can't be taken at face value. Like all businesses, media is trying to make money. Some people are willing to do more to get ahead, including lying to people and pretending like they didn't know any better. This isn't a new practice, but it's one that might be able to be stopped. Staying informed and refusing to support it are ways of combating sensationalism, but ultimately, it's up to each person to stop it for themselves. The last topic of discussion is GamerGate. Now, this is a difficult topic considering the varying points of view through which the events were seen. Right now, however, we're going to be specifically looking at the representation of women and minorities in gaming, critiques of said representation, and the massive backlash that critics received. For those who are blissfully unaware of what I'm talking about, GamerGate is the name given to a controversy that started in around 2014, centered around the male gaze in gaming. But why did it cause such an outcry? Before we get to that, a quick definition. The gaze is the lens through which a viewer is subjective, which affects their perception of individuals or a group of people. But why is the gaze such a hot topic of debate? A quick content warning before we begin, though, there was mention of difficult topics such as death threats, homophobia, transphobia, and more. On one side of the Gamergate controversy, there were media critics that discussed and criticized the gaming industry for projecting sexist depictions of women in their games through a term known as the male gaze. On the other, there was a group of predominantly heterosexual, white, cisgender, and young males who saw these critiques as an attack on their identities. This battle all began because gaming was a relatively new form of media being marketed towards a young male audience. As a result, most mainstream media critics and philosophies were not interested in gaming until recently. Thus, gaming became a safe haven for mostly straight male audience that interacted with it. However, when female critics and developers began reaching prominence, some people saw that as a breach of this safe haven. In response, death threats, doxing, and attacks of character were sent to figures like Anita Sarkeesian, Zoe Quinn, and Brianna Wu. Sarkeesian was a particular favorite of so-called gamergaters because she was the most popular critic of gaming's problems. Sarkeesian discussed the damsel in distress trope in gaming, where a large number of female characters were framed as being helpless and in need of saving. Sarkeesian argued that the gaze was being crafted in a way that was deeply sexist, citing the outfits female characters wear. She argued that they were designed for sex appeal in mind, not practicality. She stated that this is both sexist and misrepresentation. These discussions are not new concepts. They have been around and widespread for over 45 years in film and television, but were now being applied to gaming for the first time in a major way. Many gamers reacted negatively to these critiques and thought they were a form of censorship. In response, they tried to censor Sarkeesian and her peers, claiming that feminism was an evil force. So now that we've got a general idea of what Gamergate was, we can discuss the relevance of this topic. A lot of this happened years ago and has mostly been forgotten, so why am I discussing it? Well, it's important because of the effect it had on the industry. Game developers are toning down the sex appeal and are crafting female characters with more agency. So this means there's a happy ending, right? Well, unfortunately, this debate is very much still around, occasionally ignited by a new game or discussion of the problems with gaming. In June of 2020, Naughty Dog released The Last of Us Part 2, a follow-up to one of the most beloved and highly acclaimed games in recent years. However, the sequel's creative director received an extreme amount of hate for the inclusion of openly gay and transgender characters, including the main character and her girlfriend. Homophobic and transphobic sentiments came in swarms along with death threats. In order to stop this, hateful comments need to be pushed against, focusing instead on legitimate criticism, while also encouraging developers to tell the stories that they want to tell. Having developers focus on sex appeal and forced heteronormativity is only going to make the problem worse. If more games involve good representation of female and LGBT characters, Perhaps this will aid hateful people in getting over their biases. Gaming is a beautiful art, even if it is flawed. As Sarkeesian herself said, we can be critical of the things we love. That is possible. Discussing the gays isn't an attack, it's a call for things to be made better for everyone. Someday things will be better, but it is going to take a lot of work to improve. Thanks for watching.